All right, a little bit about Kevin Kitz. He is the CEO of KitzWorks, which provides innovative solutions in geothermal energy and process efficiency. Kevin has been a specialist in geothermal development for over 35 years. KitzWorks helps clients create commercial investment opportunities by repurposing existing technology in new ways.
Yeah, and this is a relatively new relationship. He was kind of not necessarily a last minute, but I had some people reach out and they're like, hey, Idaho has this phenomenal geothermal potential. And I had reached out to a couple people that are in the geothermal space or that energy space, and they pointed me in Kevin's direction. And so we had a conversation, and he kind of blew my mind. He kind of challenged some energy paradigms that I had, when I came in, when I'm thinking about renewables. And so I'm super honored and grateful that Kevin decided to join us and tell us about, geothermal energy and all the potential that we have, especially here in Idaho. So let's give a round of applause for Kevin.
Kevin Kitz.
Hi, everybody. The piece of paper is because I've heard a couple of things today that have really interested me, and I want to try to do my best to weave those back into this talk, even though I haven't rehearsed that part. So the first one was seeds, sustainability, energy, and education. So I hope that talking about geothermal is going to hit those three. Diversity is typically is often referred to both in among people and experiences, and I'm going to try to show you how we can do some of that with geothermal, and as well as I want you to consider diversity of energy sources. And finally, safety. Anybody can stretch an acronym. I could stretch to safety, but I'm going to go instead of safety, I'm going to go for synergy, and try to show you how geothermal can be part of a synergistic response to synergistic solution to energy, the energy issues that face us, the very real threat of climate change, which is fact-based, and the opportunities we have to do things smarter. And we're gonna talk about that with geothermal energy, and it really is a universal energy source in a lot of different forms. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about geothermal and direct heat use. And so here's an example of an aquaculture operation in Idaho using geothermal heat to keep the alligators warm. We're going to talk about geothermal heat for power, and I was very fortunate enough to be the project engineer for this for Idaho's first geothermal power plant. And we're going to talk about geothermal heat pumps, which really are universally applicable every climate for building heating and cooling. And we're going to take that idea one step farther with grid amplified geothermal energy. So that's what we're going to cover today. And so what does geothermal bring? Well, first of all, it's just much more labor intensive than other forms of energy. So that builds jobs and local economy and starts to get at that diversity issue as well. Fights climate change. It's a renewable energy, virtually zero carbon emissions, and it's reliable, 24/7, all weather conditions. And so it makes a good synergistic element to our other energy options. So let's take a look at several different levels of geothermal energy, going from shallow to deep and cool to hot. And so shallow and cool are geothermal heat pumps. So this is using the top couple hundred feet of the earth to heat and cool buildings. It can be used both in direct buildings. It can be used for some process heating and cooling. And we're going to see a way for it to actually be used for grid power storage. The next one is a little bit deeper, medium temperature geothermal heat. So this is actually heat from down, much deeper. And those can be wells that are hundreds to thousands of feet deep, maybe up to 200 or 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is heat that's used for industrial processes, greenhouses, and district heating systems like we have in Boise, and we'll see in a second. And lastly, once we go even deeper to thousands of feet deep, up to 10,000 feet deep or even deeper sometimes, rarely, and temperatures above 260, typically above 280 Fahrenheit, we could get into geothermal power generation and get that base load always-on power. So looking at that first topic area, geothermal heating, Boise is not only the first geothermal heating district in the country, it is also the largest. It started in the 1890s. Unfortunately, we've lost the beautiful old natatorium that Boise was well known for, but the houses that were originally heated with geothermal energy back in the 1890s are still heated with geothermal energy today. So that definitely gets to that idea of sustainability. Boise actually has 4 independent geothermal heating districts. So we have the largest of those. So the first one was the historic Warm Springs District, but the largest is owned and operated by the city of Boise. And it serves 91 buildings, 5.5 million square feet of zero carbon heating, as well as keeping the pools warm at the YMCA and domestic water heating in all of these buildings. And so as you're walking around Boise, you may see, downtown Boise, you may see this emblem. And what that means is that that building is being heated by geothermal energy. So let's talk about geothermal power. We saw the picture from Idaho, but here's a picture from Iceland. Iceland is, in Olympic terms, the gold medal, silver medal, and bronze medal champion of cascade use. Ending, of course, with people in Iceland in bikinis in the middle of winter at a resort. But they also do have industrial processes running off of the heat and agricultural processes running off of the heat. So geothermal power is priced more expensively than photovoltaics. And as having tried to sell geothermal power, I often hear this, oh, well, it's more expensive, why should I buy it? Well, of course, it's obvious that PV isn't a round-the-clock solution, and to make PV work, we have to do a couple of other things. We have to, in today's day, we're going to have to add batteries, and we're also going to still have to have gas turbines on the system. There's going to be no avoiding that. And so the combined cost is not what the cost is of the power purchase agreement. So this is really the wrong question, what is the cost of power? The much better question is, well, oh, sorry, before we get there, let's talk about jobs. So very few jobs that come out of this, very few cascade uses from this kind of power system. Whereas in geothermal, there's a huge potential for cascade industry, economic activity, and, like I mentioned before, a lot of jobs. And so really, a much better question is, what is the least cost way to decarbonize the grid? Because this question will lead to the selection of different resources on the grid than the first question. All right, so does that mean that they're competitors? No, they're actually quite complementary. And so let's take a look at a hypothetical geothermal power plant with a 10 megawatt rating. So it's a thermal process, so in the summer it produces less power, and in the winter it produces more power because the air temperatures are changing. Now let's take a look at solar. So what I did is I took 2019's US utility solar and I scaled it all back to 10 megawatts so that it would fit on the same graph. And let's see what happens. Well, in the winter, of course, the solar output is low. Well, that's a pretty good match to geothermal. What about in the summer? Well, that's when it peaks. And in fact, the whole year is pretty darn complementary to a geothermal power plant. And so synergy, that's what I altered that last S to be, and you can see that geothermal and solar actually are quite synergistic together on the grid, and wind is going to have the same sort of effect. All right, so that really takes us through the traditional heat type geothermal, and I want to bring in here now a couple of other quotes. One was, when you want to make major changes, change how you see things. So one of the things that I have slowly come to the realization of as I've worked on renewable energy is, this is kind of an odd analogy, but I feel like I'm working on a methadone program. You know, that renewable energy is better than coal, it's better than burning natural gas, but it hasn't really addressing the basic problem of our basic problem, which is that we're using too much energy. We haven't addressed the addiction. And this gets into the idea of sustainability that came up with agriculture is, do we really want to sustain from where we are now with broken soil? And I would say no. And do we really want to sustain from where we are now as a very energy wasteful society? I'm going to say no. And so I want to introduce you now to geothermal heat pumps and why that breaks that paradigm. So geothermal heat pumps reduce the total amount of energy used by a building off of the grid or out of a pipeline and result in CO2 reductions, and amazingly, they also lower the cost of power on the grid. And so when we talk about environmental justice, that's a really big factor. What's the cost of energy? Well, geothermal heat pumps bring down the cost of energy. So to make it applicable, we're going to, of course, want to build these on new, but we're also going to want to retrofit. And we're going to want to do it cost effectively, and because this is America, we're going to want to do it profitably. And that's why we're so successful, because we can bring big business to bear on solving problems and getting things done. And so let's set a goal. How about $2 billion of investment in geothermal heat pumps? That's big enough to catch the eye of at least some financial groups. So what is that? Well, that's 100,000 to 200,000 homes, which is like less than 2% of the homes in California and less than 25% of the homes in Little Idaho. So maybe we ought to set a little bit more of a stretch goal. Maybe we ought to be looking at $200 billion of investment in geothermal heat pump in the next 10 years. Now we can get something, now we can start having a real impact. So in our gigantic audience here, for those viewing at home, we're successfully implementing distancing. Who knows what the energy source is that's used in a geothermal heat pump? Okay, everybody have their answer in their head? The answer is solar energy. This is the world's most efficient solar energy because we're using the ground as a collector. And you can see that in this diagram, we've got two types of loops. We've got horizontal loops, which are great for rural installations, but since most people live in much more compact situations, the vertical loops are really what we're going to focus on today's talk. So geothermal heat pumps move energy efficiently between the ground and the building. And so we're going to get into how geothermal heat pumps work. We're going to do it without math and equations. And so the first question I have is, the next question I have, who in the audience owns a heat pump? Think about it. Got your answer? I hope you all answered, I do, because a refrigerator is a heat pump. It pumps heat from the inside of the refrigerator to the outside of the refrigerator. And that's really what's happening with a heat pump. We're pumping heat from one side of the building to the other side of the building, either in to out or out to in. So geothermal boreholes, this is a picture one on the left. It is not a well. In a well, water flows into or out of the well. This is a drilled hole in the ground. A piece of plastic pipe is looped into that hole, and then it's grouted in place. So water flows through that pipe and transfers heat to or from the ground. And it can be installed in very large facilities like the university here in Toronto. In fact, the library here on campus is geothermally heat pump heated. Or it can be a small building like this house. So let's look at how it works. So here's a typical American building heating system. So we've got an air conditioner, and we've got a gas furnace. So we've got to supply gas. We've got to supply electricity, especially to a large amount of electricity on those hot days. And as a result, we've got lots of waste heat that we're putting into the air. So geothermal heat pump is going to provide exactly that same functionality to the building, but it's just going to do it more efficiently. So we're going to get rid of the gas furnace, and we're going to instead absorb that stored solar energy out of the ground to heat the building with just a small amount of electricity to do that. We're going to get rid of that outdoor unit, and we're instead going to get rid of our heat. Instead of to the air, we're going to get rid of it into the ground, which is much more efficient to do that and uses less electricity. But now we start to recycle that energy. So that heat that we put into the ground in the summer is now available in the ground to heat the building in the winter. And when we pull that heat out of the ground in the winter, it makes the ground cold, which makes the cooling mode more efficient. So what does that sound like? The classic objective in recycling: reduce, reuse, recycle. And that's exactly what geothermal heat pumps do for building energy for heating and cooling. And what's really amazing is that it makes a gigantic cut in how much energy we're using total from pipelines from the grid. A 65% reduction, more or less, in heating. We cut the energy that we need for cooling the building by half, and we can cut our water heating use in the summer by essentially 100%, and in the overall for the year about 75%. And so this to me is not a methadone program. This is really getting at the idea of changing how we use energy, reducing the amount, raising, instead of being sustainable down here, let's raise the level that we want to be sustainable at. And I think that this is what that does. So the problem is not technology. We don't need any new technology. What we need is economy of scale. The problem is we've got very small installation volumes. Less than 1% of homes in the US are fitted out with a geothermal heat pump. I suspect it is way less than 1%. And so if we could get the installation volume up, the cost of putting them in would go down. And if we got bigger volume in, of course, the financiers would be interested. That lowers the cost of money. That allows financing of these projects, just like what happened with rooftop solar. And all that volume that's going up drives down manufacturing costs, which lowers cost of the system, and we get into this beneficial circle. So we can get there. Okay, so the next step is I want to step back a little bit and look at the idea of, go back to vehicular air pollution. So we started out with this really sweet ride, right? It just had one little teeny tiny problem, is that it was a really highly polluting starting point. And what we did is we made cars use less polluting, and we also, with hybrids, figured out how to recycle the energy of braking, to make them even more efficient. But we all know this already, even though we don't mostly use it. The best way to reduce transportation energy use is to share our energy use. And so we can see a very similar path in building energy. So we're going to start out with this highly polluting this initial point that's highly polluting: gas furnaces, coal and gas electricity. And we're going to make the process less polluting. We're going to use geothermal power, we're going to use wind, and we're going to use solar. And we just saw that we can make it use less energy by capturing waste energy. But just like in transportation, when we share energy use, that's when we get the biggest benefit of all. And in this case, it's a district energy system that's going to let us do that. And so there's lots of examples of this. I'm just going to show you one. It's Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction, Colorado. This is a very cold environment. They have not burned natural gas in over 5 years. So that is a big carbon reduction right there. 16 buildings, 1 million square feet. Simultaneously, this loop of water, that geothermal water that's flowing around, is providing heating to some buildings, cooling to others, and water heating wherever it's needed, all at the same time. Capital cost-wise, by sharing the energy, the total number of boreholes that had to be drilled was cut in half. So that is a gigantic capital cost savings. They cut their water use by 50%. And in terms of grid cost, the cost of that was cut by over a megawatt. So, it's really significant economic impacts by sharing energy use in this district energy system. And this can be implemented in many places. In fact, in Boston, they're getting ready to replace natural gas infrastructure with this kind of an approach. Okay, so we're gonna switch to the next topic here, and I'm gonna go back to my my quotes from today, and that was, we can't use the same thinking to solve a problem that was used to create the problem. And so that's what I want to try to do here is introduce a new way of thinking about geothermal heat pumps, about the grid, and about energy use. So this is a technology that I'm working to develop here in Idaho. It's applicable everywhere. And I call it GABES, Grid Amplified, Building Energy, Seasonal Storage. And what the objective here is this is really a grid technology. This is really aimed at grid cost and CO2 reduction, a grid technology rather than a building energy technology. It does building energy efficiency, it reduces building energy use, but its value is in the utility. So we're going to start by taking a look at not quite the same system, but a very inspirational project in Calgary. So you think of Calgary, pretty far north. This is not going to be a great solar resource. And yet, 52 homes have 95% of their building heat provided by solar thermal collectors. I forgot to mention at the beginning, if people have any questions, feel free to set them in. I'm going to aim to have some time left over at the end to answer questions. So temperatures are below 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, peak temperatures. So we've got the little dots are the geothermal boreholes. They're arranged differently in this. This is a borehole thermal energy storage system, BTES. And so in a BTES, you arrange the boreholes a little bit differently. As you can see, they're connected radially out from the center. And the way this system works is that we've got solar collectors on the roof of the garages. Those solar collectors gather heat all summer, in the fall, and on the few sunny days in the winter, and they deliver that heat into the center of the BTES and store it. So the ground is heated up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's 70 or 80 degrees Celsius. And then, so this is the water flows from the outside of the ring, outside of the BTES, to the solar collectors, and then back into the center. So in the winter, we reverse that flow, and we flow from the outside into the center where the water heats up, comes back to the buildings at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and directly heats the buildings with blowers. So this is a good system. Unfortunately, it's not very economic, and so although it's been in operation since 2011 or something, or even earlier actually, it has never been replicated. It's just too expensive. And so the improvement that we're going to make here is we're going to switch to geothermal heat pumps, and we're going to heat that ground up to a much lower temperature that reduces losses, and we're going to use an air source heat pump to get that heat into the ground when the air is warm or it's advantageous from a grid perspective. There's also a case very similar to what GABES is about at a Marine Corps base in Albany, Georgia. This is, of course, a cooling dominant environment, and this building is filled with people and computers, so very much cooling dominant. Again, the same idea of a BTES. except in this case, it's going to be a cold one instead of hot, and that cold water is going to flow into the center and then out to the outside to charge this B-test with cold. And the way they're doing it is with a radiator, a big radiator. So whenever the B-test is warmer than the air, they can run the radiator and cool it off. So again, so cold to the center to charge it, and then cold out of the center, except in this case, we're not using the cold directly. There's going to be a geothermal heat pump, a water source heat pump, that pulls heat out of the building, puts it into the water. So it's using water. The water is just a carrier to bring the heat to the ground, to get rid of it. So the design improvement is going to be, again, to use an air source chiller instead of a radiator, which means that basically we can chill this thing anytime we want to, whenever it's advantageous to do so. So let's take a look at what Gabe's might look like. So we're going to start out with this, and we'll just look at a cold weather, a cooling application first. So here's an air source chiller. It's going to provide cold into this B-test, and then a water source heat pump, a geothermal heat pump, is going to pull heat out of the building or out of the buildings if it's a district energy system, and put that heat back into the water. So cold into the center to charge the B-test, and cold out of the center to supply the district energy system. So, but it works just as well for a hot B-test. We can use, instead of an air source chiller, we're going to use an air source heat pump to put hot into the center. And so this is a proposal that we're talking about with an Army, Air Force and Army base in Anchorage. So again, I want to emphasize this is about lowering grid cost and CO2. Building efficiency and cost is important, but secondary. And I think when we look at this example, you'll be able to see why. So from a grid perspective, in Idaho Power and in most utilities around the country, we really want to avoid this. So this is a temperature graph of Boise. The top two are the maximum temperature during the day, and the average high temperature during the day, and the average low temperature, and the peak low temperature during the day. So in a cooling mode, we really want to avoid trying to cool buildings with hot air. That's inefficient, uses a lot of electricity, and that electricity that we're using is either from very expensive batteries or very carbon-intensive gas-fired turbines. Instead, what we want to do is we want to store cold when it's nice and cool, and the air chiller is running very efficiently. Not only that, but in the springtime is when Idaho and the whole Pacific Northwest has lots of wind, lots of solar, lots of hydro. Prices can actually go negative, which means you get paid to take power. And so we store cold at essentially zero carbon. And because in Idaho, Boise, temperatures are cool at night, we can run the air source chiller at night and do diurnal storage as well. That allows us to reduce the size of the B-test and bring the capital cost down and affordability up. It also works just as well in the winter. We want to, generally when people are talking about decarbonizing building heating, they're talking about using heat pumps, and they're specifically talking about air source heat pumps. Well, when you try to run an air source heat pump when it's 10 degrees or below, you don't go out there without a jacket. Why? Because there's no heat in the air. Well, it's the same thing for the heat pump. There's no heat in the air, and so you end up using a tremendous amount of electricity if you use air source heat pumps to decarbonize building heating. But we're going to be using warm ground, and so it actually cuts peak demand by 75%. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to store energy again in the fall. Demand is low, and air temperatures are warm. And because sunny days in the winter are still warm-ish, we can, again, do diurnal storage to bring down capacity cost. So I keep talking about the grid. Let's take a look at that specifically. This is an Idaho power graph. And these colored dots are different decades. And so what we can see is that on the left side, load is growing very slowly. Whereas on the far right side, representing high air temperatures, the load is growing faster and faster, and the load is hardly growing at all in the middle as well. So if you want to draw a picture of a very expensive grid to operate, this is it. And so Gabe's can help with the cost of the grid, and it does that in 3 ways. First, it's going to lower that summer peak, cut that peak by 50%. And so that is a huge cost savings. It's also a huge CO2 savings. In the winter, it's going to add load. This means more megawatt hours are being sold every year, which lowers the cost of power to consumers. So there it is, environmental justice. Affordable energy is important. And finally, because we're doing that off-peak energy storage, we're raising that middle. Again, selling more power when it's cheapest to produce. So this is really a huge grid value. So Gabe's basically helps, as you can see from that, Gabe's helps integrate renewable power. It provides seasonal storage, it provides diurnal storage. I'm not going to go into the math, but without violating thermodynamics, I promise you, point of use, we're talking about 200% round-trip efficiency from a grid perspective versus 90% or less for batteries. So this is a really significant improvement. It provides our ability to get more low-carbon renewable energy onto the grid sooner. I want to take a look at one more example, which is Texas. The wind in Texas blows in the north. Of course, Houston, big city, in the south, very hot. So in the lower right corner, we've got the temperature graph, and you can see that the average August temperature is up around 95 with peaks well above that. Above that is the North Texas wind for a day in the middle of August. And you can see from that pattern that the wind is blowing the hardest in mid-morning. That's when grid load is essentially the lowest. And that when the grid is most stressed, which is right at sunset, the wind drops off. So this is a really bad fit from a grid perspective. Not only that, but on the left, you can see that wind really peaks in the spring, that the peak wind has 10 times more energy in it in the spring than the average wind does in the middle of summer. That's because the wind energy is proportional to the speed cubed. And so it doesn't take a very big change in wind speed to get a gigantic change in wind power. So let's put this all together with Gabe's. We're going to run the air source chillers in the springtime when it's cool, and we're going to store that cold in the ground. We're going to run them again mid-morning. We can run them mid-morning when the wind is blowing and air temperatures are still low, and we can put that cold in the ground. And so then, when the wind falls off at night, it doesn't matter because we've already cut the grid load dramatically. So this is a really great way to integrate a wind in Texas. And I've looked at South Dakota, I've looked at Alaska. There's lots of places that fit this kind of pattern of being able to integrate with seasonal and diurnal variations in renewable energy. So we have a choice on how we can decarbonize heating and cooling. First, we could use a battery and a regular air conditioner. So we can store energy for part of the peak, a few hours. We get a round-trip efficiency of about 90%, but we don't get any change in peak demand. So we couple this really high-tech battery with old, broken-down technology that's still sitting around in our houses. To me, this is a little bit like putting buggy wheels on your Dodge Charger. This is a technology mismatch. So a much better solution is Gabe's. So we are going to use a borehole thermal energy storage, BTES, and a geothermal heat pump. We can store energy for all of the peak. We can get more than 200% round-trip efficiency. and we get a 50% reduction in peak demand. So this is really a much better solution. But that's not the whole thing. Let's talk about jobs. So battery-based grid storage. So option one is we build a big old gigafactory, which is highly robotic. So even at the location of the gigafactory, there's not that many jobs, and there's no jobs everywhere else. Plus, we create an imported mineral dependency, which is of course the lithium. This is not really a great way to fulfill the idea of a Green New Deal or however you want to do it, creating jobs in a new economy. On the other hand, Gabe's requires jobs in every location because you have to drill the holes, because you have to install the heating and air conditioning equipment in every building that's going to be retrofitted. And on the import-export, it turns out that there are no imported holes. Every country is going to have to drill their own holes. Can't import any from an inexpensive supplier. So let's get down to the summary. I regret to say that although this is, to me, a great idea, it's not installed. It's based on 100% proven technology. There is no new technology in this, more like a new perspective. It lowers grid costs and CO2. This is where the value driver is. All of these things, cutting peaks, avoiding winter peaks, utility dispatchable. So the utility is going to pick when to charge the B-test. So if energy costs are really low, they're negative, then the utility is going to turn on that chiller and store energy in the ground. If it's really cold, and then they're going to say, okay, this is a good time to store it. Or they look ahead and they say, oh, we've got an extreme weather event coming. It's going to be 110 for 7 days. Let's charge up the B-test so that we can build resiliency into the grid. So it makes a lot of sense for this to be a utility-controlled asset. And we've talked about the storage and the enabling of renewable energy. And it has a really large economic impact. So lots of jobs and multi-billion-dollar investment potential, both with Gabe's and geothermal heat pumps. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. I think we can use geothermal energy. We can use the Earth to better life on Earth. Thanks.
Let's repeat that question so we can hear it online.
Yeah, what is, I guess, the opportunity cost, or why is geothermal not already mainstream? I mean, we started using this in Boise, in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so what happened? Like, what happened to geothermal as a viable or sustainable energy solution?
Okay, so if we take the different types of geothermal energy, so geothermal power is geographically limited. The Department of Energy's got a lot of really innovative programs going on, and private industry, to make geothermal an everywhere power source. Geothermal heat is also very limited. And this is where it starts to get into the way geothermal works. So the geothermal heating district, it doesn't run very many hours out of the year. So you've got a lot of capital cost and not very many hours to amortize that cost over. So geothermal heat pumps and Gabe's both suffer from a similar problem, which is that they are viewed as building efficiency and building cost technologies. And I hope that I've showed you that what they really are is grid, and that's where the biggest portion of the value is resides. And so the way that geothermal heat pumps, the way Gabe's is going to make penetration, is to use utility grid models to value what that peak load reduction is worth, and then to create incentives to private enterprise to put that in. There's also a good model for the utility itself to own those bore fields, to own the B-tests and the equipment that charges it, and then that would go into the utility rate base, and the utility would make money on doing that. And so it's really to use the old phrase, a paradigm shift on what the role of a utility is and where the value is.
And then we got one more question from our virtual audience. Numu Alate, what about using geothermal for greenhouses? What's the viability there?
Right. So most of the ag land in the world is not going to be on top of a hot spring, and so this is where either geothermal heat pumps or GABEs can be very, very useful, because you can create that stored heat all summer. So with GABEs especially in a greenhouse, you could use the air source heat pump to store energy at low rate all year long. You could even use off-grid photovoltaics to run the air source heat pump, put that heat in the ground, and then in winter be able to pull that heat out of the ground that you've stored. So basically a squirrel system for heat. And I think, I haven't looked at that specifically, but in my mind, that is a really viable way to tackle greenhouses and low carbon heating.
And so what would you say is the biggest opportunity or seizable opportunity around geothermal? Like, where would we start, I guess?
Geothermal heat pumps and GABEs are commercially ready. They're deployable everywhere in the country, and their impact is immediate. And so the place to start is the utilities, is for utilities to come to understand how geothermal heat pumps, how GABEs, or energy storage of any sort with geothermal heat pumps really helps them in their mission. Furthermore, I want to point out that natural gas utilities, are they natural gas utilities? Yes, but no, what they really are is that they are companies that deliver energy in underground pipes to individual buildings. That sounds like a district energy system to me. So GABEs and district energy geothermal heat pump systems provide natural gas utilities with a way to transition to a green economy without changing their basic business model and without being forced out of business. So getting rid of natural gas is going to be politically very difficult if natural gas distribution companies are forced out of business. Geothermal heat pumps and in all their different forms as district energy systems, or even as standalone, for standalone buildings, provide natural gas utilities a way to have a new product line that allows them to stay in their core business of delivering energy underground to buildings through pipes.
I guess a question that comes to mind is that infrastructure repurposable? Like when you're saying natural gas and then you're having geothermal, or do you have to build all new infrastructure out?
In Boston, they are replacing it.
Okay, replacing. Yeah.
I suspect that by the time it's going to be different. There's a lot less energy in water than in natural gas,
yeah.
And you have to go into the building and out of the building. So I suspect that it's going to be all new infrastructure for this, but. The nice thing is that by using low temperature geothermal heat pumps, it's uninsulated plastic pipe. It's the cheapest plastic pipe. It's HDPE on rolls. And so it's very cost effective to install it.
Any last question? I guess we got one here for Marvin.
You've kind of piqued my interest here talking about the infrastructure. In the state that I come from in Wyoming, we've talked to energy companies about being able to supplement or have different sources. We were talking about using gas power for turbines or whatever. And we quickly learned that our local co-ops can only deal in like a 10 or 20% increase over and above the contracts that they have with the major gas and energy suppliers. So how, I mean, as intriguing as this is it the same type of energy? Would it be a competitive to gas and electric, or is it classified as an entirely different source?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think that there is room for those two utilities, the electric utility and the gas utility, to work together. They have a shared interest. I think that I think that geothermal heat pumps in general, GABEs in particular, can lower the cost of electricity for electric utilities. But I think that in terms of managing underground pipe, there's going to be no companies in the world that are better than natural gas utilities. So the gas utility puts in the B tests, and the air source heat pump buys electricity from the utility, and in so doing lowers the cost of electricity for all users because more is being sold and expensive power periods are being avoided, and then sells energy to clients, whether it's a standalone house out in the woods or part of a district energy system. I think there's room for synergistic models that allow everybody to make money and lower the cost of energy for consumers compared to the alternatives especially. Natural gas is really cheap. If money, it's like the agriculture tax. All right. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to get in touch with me. Thanks very much.